Welcome, everyone. So great to see so many familiar faces here. This is like, I think, my second old-timer reunion in the last 6 months, so these always feel good. Bonus points to Craig, who brought bread. And
let's hear it, Craig. Let me hear your bread call.
And also, I think Craig is wearing, quite possibly, the first output from Google's sort of marketing thinking. Could you stand up, Craig, and model your piece of swag you're wearing? It's great. I'm David Krane, member of the Google Ventures team. Been here quite some time. Been fortunate to have spent a big chunk of it with Doug. This is Doug Edwards, for those of you that don't know Doug. You've seen the book. If you haven't, please buy the book. It's for sale in the back of the room. Doug has promised to stay for at least 3 hours doing very personal, involved signings, consultations, et cetera. And he still has some questions for some of you. What I thought we'd do today is spend a little bit of time first hearing from Doug, a bit of a perspective of what it was like to exit this wild race, think about it again, and then actually write about it. And I have a few questions prepared, and I'm hopeful that we'll get to audience questions and interactivity much sooner rather than later. I think the prescription was something like 10 minutes of audience participation, and I can tell already there's lots of bottled up excitement to engage with Doug. So we'll get to that pretty quickly. So Doug, what was it like?
Well, first I need to ask, is anyone from legal here? Okay, because it's being videotaped, and I'm just going to talk. So if there's anything I say that shouldn't be distributed to the whole world, I'm going to leave that to you to cut out of the tape. So, well, all of you are here, so clearly you know what it's like to work at Google. But the thing that surprised me was how hard it was to leave Google. I left on March 4th. 2005, 3, 4, 5, because that's the way you do things. And it's been 6 years and I'm still trying to leave Google. So every time I open the paper, every time I turn on television or go online, I keep running into Google did this, Google did that, the logo's everywhere. And so I had stories that would evoke in my head, and I finally figured out I needed to write those stories down. And that would be the only way that I could completely leave Google behind me. So I'm in the process of separating myself from Google, and this is the biggest step in that process. So,
what was the moment, Doug, where you actually said, I need to put this down on paper? You started with a blog, right? You might tell people a bit about the blog. But when did you commit to writing a book, and what exactly was that moment like?
Well, I did start writing a blog when I left it. It's zooglers.blogspot.org. .com, yeah. And that was interesting, but the audience for the blog kept kind of pushing me to blog more frequently, and that started to feel like work. And I was hoping not to have to work so hard at that point. So I let that go for a while, but again, I couldn't just let the stories die. There was just too much that, at least to me, was of interest. And I felt like it would be a shame not to have that come out. There were a lot of people I worked with, some of whom are in the room today, that I felt deserved some recognition for the amazing things that they had done, things that amazed me when I was here, and even more so when I started interviewing people after I left, that I didn't even realize the scope of some of the things that they had accomplished. And so I felt like it was important to get that story out. And there have been a number of books about Google written, some of which were in progress when I started mine. But the one thing that I didn't see in those books, and some of them are really excellent, Stephen Levy in particular and Ken Aletta have done a great job talking about Google, but what was missing for me was the personal element of what it felt like to be here during that period. And unless you were here or unless you were part of it, it was not really possible, I think, to recreate that. So about 2.5 years ago, I just finally decided, okay, if you ever want to get the voices out of your head, you're going to have to start writing it down. And so I did.
How much of a personal debate did you have with your conscience, if you will, when you actually decided to pull the trigger? As you know, this is a culture that was built from day one on secrecy, on preservation of our information. We were very open as a counterpoint. We were very honest. We were very transparent. But there was this documented and undocumented kind of alignment that we all shared as early members of the company, that we would not leak this information, we would not share this information, even the code names of products, the anecdotes of our beloved and quirky founders, et cetera, would stay within the walls of Google. Was there much of a wrestling match in your brain when you decided to actually put this down into the public?
Yes. More so in my wife's brain, actually. She's sitting up here. She had a lot of concerns about Google and their legal department and what they might think about my writing a book about the company. But I tried to walk a line between being just sort of gossipy and telling secrets and actually trying to inform people about how it felt to be here. And it was interesting to me, there was a fairly harsh review in the Chronicle in which the guy said, that I didn't dare to rat out my friends and enemies. And, I actually took that as something of a compliment. I mean, my goal was not to paint everything in a very negative picture. My goal was to present some of the debates that we had internally about everything from design to privacy and accurately represent the different viewpoints that people had. So I hope that I did that, and that I did it in a way that was even-handed and objective, or as objective as you can be when you're writing about things you were personally involved in.
You mentioned several times in the book that this is a company that was operating on a trajectory without much precedent in much cases. I think this project is one such example as well. I was part of this on the periphery, but I don't recall exactly when you first approached Google Inc. and said, I'd like to write a book about the company. A, I'm informing you. B, I'm asking for your help and cooperation. What was our UI like? What was our response? How did we treat you?
Actually, and I will say, Google has been great about giving me access. I interviewed a lot of people who are current Googlers. There was always somebody from PR in the room with a tape recorder, and just in case they needed to fact check it after the fact. But there really was no instance where Google said, no, you can't talk about that, or they said to somebody I was interviewing, no, that's not allowed. You can't discuss that. So I was really, happy that Google gave me the opportunity to reconstruct the past by talking to people who are still here. And of course, I talked to a number of people who are not still here. But it's been interesting to me to read about another book that's out, or is not out, about Google and the design of Google Plus. So, maybe you can tell me a little bit about the backstory of that. But no, Google was great. No complaints.
Any memorable moments from interviews? Any particular, were there any subject that leaped forward and surprised you with insights and willingness to talk and to chat? Were there others that were more reserved and you had to work a little harder to draw them out?
I had a really good conversation with Jeff Dean. He was very patient with me. He had to explain some things, 6 or 7 times before I think I gave up before he did. But Jeff had some really insightful things to offer. Paul Buchheit actually really gave me some insight into things that I hadn't considered. Sanjay, who I don't think does a lot of interviewing, was very kind to give me some of his time. And but one thing that was news to me at some level was how hard it was to build up for Yahoo. And I talked to the Bens and got some of the detail on the technical side about how they built the back end for that. So that was illuminating.
Who were some of the subjects that you aspired to interview for the book, but you couldn't get access to or couldn't get as much depth or time with that you wanted?
Well, I could always use more time with you, David, because I didn't get to put in the story. Everybody knows about David and Madonna and the Marshalls here and the unit test.
Some things are meant to be left on the editing room cutting floor.
I don't know. This might be the time to talk about that. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, yeah. So unit test, Marshall. You want to talk about unit test?
Hey, I got a phone call about 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon from Ron Perlman, who really wanted to be here to present the unit test awards today, but unfortunately our most recent earnings report tore a hole in the space-time continuum. And so he's locked in combat with demons from hell. So I used to get up at TGIF every week and say something approximately like that. Some celebrity wanted to present a unit test award, but couldn't make it because of some lame excuse. And the whole thing got started because we were wanting more unit tests, wanting to increase our quality and our repeatability and not have so many regressions and all. And a good way to do that is to write unit tests. And we had a director who had this idea of having like a weekly award that would be presented at TGIF, and then he left to go to some startup and kind of dumped the award presentation on me, and I didn't know what to say, so I just stood up there, and then that's kind of what spilled out. And I don't know that I understand it exactly, but it became something that was so memorable that to this day people still come up to me and say, oh, I remember the unit test awards are every week, or the Madonna thing, which was.
Maybe David should tell. Let me give the David.
All right, yeah.
So Marshall did a great job of this every week, in which he would announce a celebrity who was going to come and present the unit test awards. And then at the last minute, they always called to cancel. So one week he announced that Madonna was going to be there next week to present the unit test awards. And of course, everybody knew at that point the whole routine, and that Madonna would mysteriously not be able to make it. But the following week, Marshall got up and announced that, in fact, Madonna was in the building. And Madonna's music started playing very loudly off a boombox, and there was a big, buzz by the door, and in walks Madonna. David was outfitted completely.
It's so obvious, isn't it?
Yeah, he had the wig, he had the front thing.
Features.
Yeah, and the dress, and he came in dancing. I don't think you were actually singing, but you were moving pretty good. And I think you gave Wayne Rosing a lap dance, as I recall. So that was very impressive, and that lived in Google lore for quite a while. So now you have a little background on David. Ask him for the photos; they do exist.
All right, so we've heard about my sort of penultimate cultural anecdote. I'm going to throw that back at you. What's yours? What's your most embarrassing, most sort of raise the heart rate, memorable moment of your time inside of this quirky, fun culture?
Well, I don't remember ever wearing the wig, but boy, that's hard to say. I mean, probably in some meeting with Sergey where, and I see Devin's here, where we were presenting. I still remember we had worked very long and hard on developing a marketing campaign for AdWords, and we went to Sergey and presented it to him. It was a business-to-business campaign, and he just looked at it and said, "You need to think about it some more." And we were like, "Well, okay. Well, what's wrong with it? I mean, do you not like the art? Is it the copy? Is it the concept? What don't you like about it?" And he just, "You need to think about it some more." Okay, so that was kind of difficult feedback to get, and it left us, I think, kind of wondering, what do we do from here? But that was pretty typical, I think. The reactions that we got were often not terribly explicit, other than it's googly and I like it, or think some more. So I'm sure things have gotten a lot better in terms of feedback in the organization, and that things are much more explicit and directed.
So let's wind back a little bit to the function of marketing, which you were really one of the first to provoke this company to think about and to lead. For the sake of unifying everybody here, what was the precise job description? What were you chartered to do? We understand what you believe you were hired to do, and we understand the reality of sort of what day 1 through 31 looked like. But what was the spec, and what were the metrics for success that were assigned to you?
I mean, I came to think of it as my job was to do all the stuff that wasn't engineering. So customer service, globalization became a marketing function. It was basically the things that you couldn't specifically code. So that was a marketing function, clearly. And it did take me a while to figure out exactly what I should be doing, because there was no job description, clearly. I think, I came in assuming that I would do the kinds of things I had done in the previous 20 years I had spent marketing companies, like writing a marketing plan and creating a brand identity and a look and a feel, and come up with a brand book, and here are the rules for using our logo. You need X, quarter inches between us and anything else, and that was just wrong. That was not what I was supposed to do at all. What I was supposed to do, I came to realize, is help the products be more useful. And that was marketing in the early days, was write the UI text, write the FAQ, figure out the best way to present it to the public, but do it from within the product. We never had a budget to run big ads. And I was amazed when Google ran a Super Bowl spot. That was heresy when I was here. We used to make fun of companies that ran Super Bowl spots. Look how clueless they are. They're running a Super Bowl spot. So I guess now it's okay. But because it was unmeasurable, and it was wasteful and inefficient. And we were always trying to measure the results of any effort that we did on the marketing side. And I tell a story. I think you were there when we did the Apple. We went to Macworld, and we had luggage tags that said Google, and we were giving them out before, in the line before Macworld opened. And Apple's goons came and chased us away because we didn't have a permit. And so then after that, we were tracking the number of Apple searches, or Apple-related searches that were on Google. And they went up. And not a lot, but noticeably. So I mentioned to Sergey, look, our marketing worked. And he said, yeah, that's the key to Google's growth, luggage tags. I don't think he bought it. Right.
So the founders aside, and even your direct manager, our direct manager, Cindy, aside, who were your earliest advocates when you were spinning up this new thinking and these new programs, and who were some of the adversaries that you encountered along the way?
Well, we had some robust conversations. There were, it depended on the issue. I mean, I found that Salar Kamangar actually was, very easy to approach. And often, he didn't always agree with me, but I could engage him in a conversation and present a viewpoint. And if he didn't agree, he gave you, here are the reasons why I don't agree. And if we just were head-to-head, I mean, we'd play Soul Calibur to determine who was right. So usually that was me, actually. So, but there were disagreements, especially as product management developed as a force in the company, because there was no product management when I started. And Jonathan wasn't here, and Salar was in fact the first product manager. But as that organization grew, they had very set ways of doing things that were not always in alignment with the way that we saw things. So, and Marissa being the head of Google.com as a product manager for that, we, sometimes saw eye to eye and sometimes did not see eye to eye. And in the book, I talk about the points where we disagreed about some of the initiatives that we were undertaking. So, but I felt that, I mean, at the time and in retrospect, it's an engineering-driven company. Product management was closer to engineering than corporate marketing was, which was the group I was in. So usually when we had disagreements, product management would prevail, for better or for worse. Sometimes I thought it was for worse, sometimes I thought it was for better. So,
did Eric's arrival change things dramatically? Did it set you back, set you forward, or was it a neutral? I remember some remarks when he first introduced himself, cube by cube, employee by employee, and he came by our section and sort of riffing on the bad habits of Novell marketing and balloon drops at events and fireworks and all the things we wouldn't be doing at Google. Yeah. How much of that influenced your work?
Well, he did come in and tell us very quickly that we would not be doing any trade shows because Novell had a warehouse full of trucks and booths, and he wasn't going there with us. Well, our booth was, I think we had a pop-up made out of styrofoam or something. We had never spent a dime on trade show marketing. And we weren't going to do television advertising, and we weren't going to do this, and we weren't going to do that, none of which we had done or had intended to do. But it was good to hear it from Eric, so that we had no illusions that marketing was suddenly going to ascend within the organization and have a seat at eStaff. But Eric, I think, brought a level of transparency that had been missing. When Larry was running the company as CEO, it was clear that he had a vision for where Google should go. It wasn't clear what that vision was unless you were, engaged in conversation with him, at a level that I was not. So we often struggled with trying to understand what we should prioritize. And when Eric came, he made meetings more public. He made sure that notes got communicated from meetings, and it just made it easier to kind of see where we were going and what progress we had made in that direction.
Okay, so we have the context. We know what it was like when Doug got here. We know some of the opportunities. We know some of the curiosities. And we know many of the challenges. At what point, as a marketing professional, at what point did you understand that you were really breaking new ground and the work that you were doing was different and it was impactful on the things that we cared about? What are some examples of that, and how did you build on that, and how did you leave things sort of in '05?
Well, it was clear from the beginning that our approach of building traffic through word of mouth only and not doing traditional marketing. If you remember, back in the day, .coms were spending millions of dollars on promotion and marketing. They were doing TV spots, shooting gerbils against walls, and all kinds of nonsense. And so just from the fact that we did not do that we did not spend a lot of money on marketing, we were distinguished from our competition. But over time, we did start, I think, getting more comfortable with traditional marketing elements, especially as we were trying to recruit more engineers. And we did a campaign where we brought in a traditional marketing agency, actually a very hot advertising agency called Crispin Porter Bogusky. And they came in and worked on the Google recruitment campaign that we did. And that involved, we put up a billboard that just had a question, which was the first 10-digit prime occurring in e.com. And if you were able to figure out what the first 10-digit prime in e was and went to that URL, there was a page that would then take you to another set of puzzles that would eventually take you to Google Recruiting. And we put out the Google Labs aptitude test. I don't know if any of you have seen that, but which was a series of questions like an SAT form that was intended to test your aptitude for being an engineer at Google. It was really a success in terms of public relations. We got coverage in the New York Times and CNN and the Wall Street Journal, and it was remarkable how much buzz it generated. Unfortunately, it did not lead to a lot of engineering hires. So at that time, Shona was head of HR or that part of the organization, and she decided that it would not come out of their budget the next year. But Alan Eustace and Ors felt that it might have been worth doing, but we did let it stop after that first year. So
talk about the Google Voice too. You said recently that one of your proudest accomplishments, helping Google find its voice, distinguish its voice, and publish its voice. I believe that too was one of the more unconventional things that you worked on and became a tremendous asset for the company.
Well, the nice thing about being the only English major in a company full of engineers is that people didn't really seem to care that much about what I wrote. I could just say whatever I felt like, and unless it was factually wrong from an engineering perspective, it pretty much got posted on the website. And so that was, I'd come out of the San Jose Mercury News, where I'd been for 7 years, where everyone was an editor, and everyone wanted to change every word of everything that was written. So it was really refreshing to be here, where people, as long as you got the grammar correct, because rules are important, you were okay saying what you. So Amit, where's Amit? I just saw him a minute ago. Oh, there he is. Okay, so Amit, liked lemurs. I think that came from you, right? Was it Craig? Okay, Craig liked lemurs. Okay. So all of our examples in the FAQ suddenly started involving lemurs. I'm into lemur racing. Will people know? Will they be able to find out? And so we started, putting things into the communication with users that were, Simpsons references, just the kind of things that you would say to friends. And that, I think, helped give a more human edge to the communication we had, and people started feeling that Google was more like a friend than just a corporation, a bunch of wires and technology. And then, around the toolbar launch, which was, I think, one of the things that I'm proudest of working on was when we launched Toolbar, and the advanced features element of Google Toolbar, if you enabled it, would allow you to see the page rank of any page that you went to. There would be a little green bar. To do that, of course, Google had to know every page that you went to. So if you're a user, you might not be aware that turning on advanced features means that Google has the ability to track all of your movements across the internet. And that concerned me. I think most companies at the time would have recognized that that was an issue, and they would have promptly buried notification of that in the EULA, in the end user license agreement, in very small type on page 37. And instead, we decided we wanted to make it very prominent. And so I wrote a line which was, read this, it's not the usual yada yada, in bright red, big font, and then underneath it said something like, Google can see where you're going, if you enable this feature. And we had some discussion around that. Bay is here, and I think Bay, had legitimate concerns about whether or not that would just scare users away in droves. And Toolbar was a very important strategic part of what we were doing then, because Microsoft was getting ready to incorporate Google Search into the operating system, into their new version of Windows, which meant that people might not go to Google. So we wanted to have a toolbar that would be persistent as users traveled the web. It was strategic for us. We needed as many people as possible to download the toolbar. And John Doerr on the board of directors was adamant that we needed to have millions and millions of people using the toolbar. Putting up a warning message that told you Google's tracking you if you enable this feature might have worked against that strategy. So it would have been very easy for Google for Larry and Sergey to say, no, we can't do this. It's too scary, it's too risky. But they didn't. And when the toolbar launched, it had that message in bright red type. Everyone who installed it saw that message. And instead of alarming people, it actually reassured people. And there was no big uproar around Google's invading my privacy, because anytime somebody started to complain about it, other users who had installed the toolbar would start saying, well, didn't you see the big red letters? How could you miss it? It was right there in front of you. It's your choice whether or not you want to do it. And I think that actually gave Google a lot of leeway in terms of privacy for a long time, because people assumed that we were the good guys, because we're warning you if we're doing something that might concern you. Later on, it wasn't quite so easy to get the okay to do that. I mean, there were other instances where we were doing some privacy things that might have concerned people that, I think we were more reluctant to talk about up front.
So you were here for the crystallization and kind of the institution of a number of these constants. The focus on the user, the willingness to challenge conventional marketing wisdom, do things different, play with the logo, have fun on April Fool's Day, introduce products in an unconventional way. You talk about Gmail quite a bit in the book. Let's fast forward to the 6 years that you've been gone, and I'd love your audit, your assessment of the state of Google's marketing in the last 6 years. You mentioned a Super Bowl ad. Did any of these constants hold true? Do they ring through in the company's marketing today? Where are we falling short? What opportunities are we missing? And what do you celebrate about what we're doing in marketing?
Well, I did think the Super Bowl spot was brilliant. I thought that was great. I mean, if you're going to run a Super Bowl spot, that was a good one to run. I think around the launch of Buzz, for instance, and some of the privacy issues that came up there, it might have been avoidable. I think there is a tendency sometimes, and I talk about this actually in the Wall Street Journal interview I did the other day, the fact that there are not enough irrational people at Google. You look around the room, everybody here is very rational. You're very forward thinking. You just, A, then B, then C, then D. And clearly something makes sense. You go ahead with it. The rest of the world has a lot more people who go from A to J and then back to D and then jump to X. And they don't always understand that just because something logically makes sense, that they shouldn't be scared of it. And so, I looked at the launch of Buzz, and it was scary to me, and if I think if I'd been in the room when people were talking about it, I probably would have said, this is scary, and you need to be careful about this. It's going to freak people out. But, the story that I told about Gmail was when people started freaking out about their ads showing up targeted to Gmail messages when we first launched Gmail. And I went to Sergey and I said, we have to deal with a privacy issue. I was doing customer service, and it was clearly a big concern. And he just looked at me and said, there is no privacy issue. We are not reading people's email. We're not doing anything wrong, so there is no issue. Tell that to the thousands of people who are emailing us and saying, you're invading my privacy, or Liz Figueroa, the state senator who's trying to pass laws outlawing Gmail because it's reading your email. So yes, technically he is correct. We are not doing anything wrong, so there is no issue. But of course, that's not the way the world sees it. And I think that same kind of attitude, happened with Buzz. Look how much time you can save if we automatically, import all of your Gmail contacts into Buzz. It's efficiency. You're saving time, and that's got to be good, right? Everybody would agree with that. Yes and no.
So back to Gmail. With the clarity of hindsight, what would you have done differently if you had the controls to the knobs and dials that dictated how we launched and introduced that product?
Well, David, you and I were both kind of on the hook for Gmail. We worked, as I recall, on the press release together. And I remember the night before Gmail launched, Sergey came by. Because we had fought this battle and lost, which was launching on April Fool's, which was the original plan because Sergey thought it would be funny. And then Eric, came in and said, no, that would be a bad idea, which I thanked him for because I thought it was a horrible idea. It was our first major initiative since the launch of the search engine, and we're going to do it on April Fool's. Seemed kind of dangerous. And I believe you also were not exactly ecstatic about the fact that all the PR was going to be a joke. Literally, we had to write a funny press release. That was Sergey's stipulation.
That press release lives today, and it's kind of fun to blast back into the time capsule and pull that up on Google and read just the absurdity of the words that we put in front of journalists and presented to them as fact. And I, too, remember a lot of pain and discomfort leading up to the launch and much feedback from members of the media saying to me, if I put this in print in tomorrow's New York Times and you guys are screwing with me, that's not a joke anymore.
We will not be amused. Yeah. But the night before we launched, we'd gone through this whole thing of launching it on April Fool's. Eric said, no, we're not going to launch it on April Fool's. At the last minute, Sergey overruled him. And that night, Sergey came by while we were working on the press release, and he asked, is this a bad thing to do? Is this a mistake? And I had been at Google long enough at that point that I no longer said things like, absolutely, you shouldn't do it, because I had learned that was not very convincing. It was better to kind of say, well, let's look at the upside and the downside, the risk, it's a trade-off, whatever. And, we ended up doing it. Maybe if I'd thrown myself in front of the train harder, we would not have, but I doubt it. It was a done deal. And, it started off well. We got a lot of buzz. We got a lot of really positive feedback to Gmail. It was fun for a while, but things started to turn pretty quickly. And I think the fact that we hadn't been able to pre-brief, which I know you wanted to do, pre-brief journalists and experts so they could talk about it to others in the press, that ended up being not a good thing. So, yeah, I would do it differently, probably.
Moment of housekeeping. We have a microphone on the side here, so if you have a burning question, please queue up. We'd love to get more engagement from people in the audience. If not, we'll have Marshall come back and do another bit from unit testing. So, Google today, you've spent a lot of time blogging, tweeting, Google Plussing, Facebooking about Google Plus, learning that product, learning that UI, learning that model. Tell us a little bit about some of your insights, some of your questions, and where the product is succeeding and falling short for you.
Well, first off, congratulations. I don't know if any of you worked on it. I think it's great. I mean, I'm really impressed with it, and I look at it as a first iteration. But for a first iteration, it's pretty damn good. There are a couple of small things that I'm finding frustrating, like the fact when I try to do a Hangout, it doesn't recognize the camera on my Mac for some reason, so I can listen to people, but they can't see me. But that's probably the technology on my end. Some of the privacy things, like, I sent out a post, I marked it with circles, and then I wanted to change it to be public, couldn't do it. Once it's up, you can't change the settings. But those are trivial. The service itself and the extent of it clearly is a very strong platform, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it develops over time. Facebook has been, for me, something of a necessary evil. After I left the company, suddenly, I had far fewer people sending me emails and people to talk to, and Facebook gave me an opportunity to reconnect with people. And I've enjoyed using it. So, I think the product has a lot of value. I would much prefer to use a service that is more granular in the privacy settings, that allows you to determine who's going to see what more easily than I think Facebook does.
So in some senses, as a marketer, you've seen this movie before, right? Google enters in the late 90s into a field that's very crowded with dominant search players. Jabba the Hutt is the reference you use to Yahoo in the book. There's another Jabba the Hutt today in social. Do you have advice for Google's marketing teams, when we think about stepping on the gas and raising the profile and the awareness of Google+? What did you learn in the search wars that now can apply to social?
Well, it's been interesting to me, the apparent animosity between Google and Facebook. From the outside looking in, and maybe it's press generated, but there certainly seems to be a lot of ill will between the two companies. And more, I think, from the end of Facebook coming towards Google and the campaign that they did with Burson Marsteller and so forth. So I would suggest that Google maintain the high road. And I think, the fact that you have 10 million users already signed up is pretty impressive and augurs well for the future of the product. I think if Google continues to do what they did when we were fighting against Yahoo and other companies, which was focus on the product, don't get caught up in pissing matches and back and forth with the company, always take the high road, and just let the product speak for itself. I think there's an enormous opportunity there.
And since you're an informed observer, same question if you're wearing the Facebook hat. What advice do you give them when competing with us? If you're looking at it from their perspective, Google did do that, kept their head down, and the best product won in the search wars. What advice do you give Facebook?
I would tell Facebook not to spend so much time looking back over their shoulder at Google, and spend more time developing the kind of features that Google is already putting in place, and then trying to figure out what the next iteration of that's going to be and get ahead of Google on developing that. What I learned at Google is technology matters, and if you have the best product and the best features, people will come to you. And marketing can accelerate or decelerate that process, but ultimately it is the product that people rely on. So I'm not convinced Facebook has put as much time into building the technology as I already see in the technology behind Google. So, I would, and that was, I think, Yahoo's flaw. One of their biggest flaw, right? Terry Semel was at Yahoo. They were an entertainment company. They were a media company. They were not a technology company. And that made them reliant on Google to supply search, which was great for Google, may not have been so great for Yahoo. So if you allow yourself to become weak in the area that your product is developed in, I think that's a recipe for disaster.
That's great. Let's take a question at the mic.
Yeah, when you were talking about Gmail launching on, whether it would launch on April 1st or not, you said that I guess it was Sergey who overruled Eric and said, no, we're going to do it. Can you talk a little bit about the decision-making process at the top? I mean, would it be a vote where Sergey, Larry would vote and overrule Eric, or how did that sort of thing tend to happen in the early days?
Well, before Eric, it was certainly easy, but Larry and Sergey did what they wanted. When Eric came, I believe what is said, and I wasn't sitting in all the E-staff meetings where these decisions were made, but I think Larry and Sergey tended to vote as a block. And so if Eric opposed and Sergey felt strongly that we should do it, my sense, and again, not being in the room, but my sense was that Larry would probably lean toward agreeing with Sergey, in which case it was 2-1. So that may have changed, but those two always seem to have a very strong connection. And while they argued, and I quoted you in the book talking about times that they argued about data and things, they still seem to end up in the same place most of the time.
I think they're also, just to augment Doug's perspective on that recall, there was a tremendous tidal wave that Sergey was surfing organized around April 1st. And there was no backing him off his enthusiasm and his energy, as many of us early timers remember about April Fool's Day, and the fun that we can have in the product, in our voice, and some of the most unconventional things that we can do as a company to talk to our users and play with them a little bit. And so I think this was two parallel lines that happened to converge right about April 1, 2004, a product introduction and April Fool's Day. And Sergey saw that as by far the most exciting opportunity to sort of blend them both together.
Too good to pass up.
That's right.
Hey, everything's in alignment. And just to be clear, April Fool's was a nightmare. Where's Michael Krantz? There he is. Stand up, Michael. Take a bow. Here's a
round of applause.
You're still doing
Michael.
April Fool's now, right? Yeah. So, because trying to come up with something that you could put on a website seen by millions of people, children, women, infants, and that would still amuse Sergey, the intersection of those two circles was very, very small. And it had to be edgy enough that he would go for it. And it had to be family friendly enough that you didn't mind showing it to a large percentage of the world's population. So it was a challenge. And I remember I had worked up this whole April Fool's joke one year, which I thought was really clever, and had written it all out and it was all ready to go. And Sergey looks at it and he says, oh yeah, that's okay. But you know what's really funny? Pigeons. Pigeons are really funny. We should do an April Fool's joke about pigeons. And so, I had like 4 hours to write Pigeon Rank, and he calls me, or he texted me or emailed me, whatever it was at the time. Doug, come quick. There are some pigeons on the ledge outside my window. Bring your camera. We'll take a picture. Can we get a keyboard and put some crumbs on it so that it looks like the pigeons are pecking on the keyboard? And, fortunately, Dennis Wong, was on the staff, and he was able to Photoshop something that did not involve climbing out on the ledge to take pictures of pigeons. And
I just have to say, Doug, just for a second, that years and years later, no matter how many millions of hours we have spent doing April Fool's jokes since your day, anybody who hears that I work at Google and that I work on April Fool's jokes, they're like, oh, you mean like the pigeons?
Yeah.
Like, yes, Doug's fucking pigeons. Yes.
I hired Michael, and I hired him because I had interviewed thousands of writers who were wonderful tech writers or wonderful marketing writers, and when I'd ask them, write me an April Fool's joke, they just froze, and they couldn't do it. And Michael came in, he had half a dozen April Fool's jokes, any one of which we could have put on the site the next day. So I said, we got to hire this guy. This is the guy who can come in and help. So, and I think he's done a really remarkable job with it. Yes, young man.
Hi. So my name is Aaron Rothman. I'm a product manager in AdWords. And there's been this rumor going on for a really long time that you actually named the product after your son, Adam Edwards. I was wondering if you could address that.
My son, Adam Edwards, who's sitting right here. No, it was not actually after Adam. It was after Edwards. We had been debating bywords, ads direct. We had a number of different names that we were trying to come up with for AdWords. And it was an entire company kind of activity. You didn't just give it to marketing and say, come up with a name for our new product. You put it out on Googlers or Googler's Misc and asked anybody who had an opinion to come up with ideas. And there were a lot of ideas. Everybody wanted to contribute. And so we went back and forth. And I really liked bywords. That was the name that I thought most clearly identified what the product was about. And I can't remember if it was Susan or Salar felt like that gave the impression we were selling search results. And so they did not want us to say bywords. So I went back and I thought about it overnight and came back and I had a long list of things that were really terrible. And at the bottom of the list was AdWords. And I sent in the note, I suggested it and I said, well, and it's also got the added benefit of it sounds like Edwards, which to me is an enormous benefit and really, and everybody liked AdWords for whatever reason. So I tell people that it is named after Edwards. But in fact, it was just kind of an obvious, derivation of bywords and ads direct.
I don't know if any of the other old-timers had the same private Google integrity filter just fire, but mine activated when I heard bywords. It sounded, too, very much like selling search results and something that we wouldn't do.
So there's clearly some inside story or joke about this loaf of bread going around.
Oh. Craig, come on up, Craig. Craig Silverstein, employee number 1 at Google.
Hi, everyone. So there are a few things at Google that are still here today that I'm responsible for. One is the M&Ms in the snack kitchens. I was not going to let that be cut. And another thing that I used to do when the company was smaller is I would make bread. We got a bread machine, and I would make bread in it once a week or so, and then we would all gather around and eat it. I tried to keep it up for quite a while, but the company's a little bit too big now to make bread for everyone. But I figured that maybe this particular talk might be small enough that we could bring it back for a day.
I have to say, no butter.
I said they were going to bring the butter. Someone who's not here promised to bring the butter.
It's healthier this way.
But I have to say, the smell of the bread takes me instantly right back to 1999 and Craig walking around, bread! That's how he would announce it was done. So you'd be sitting in your cubicle trying to get stuff done and bread! And everybody would just kind of flock to the kitchen. So it was a much smaller company then.
It's very biblical.
Yeah.
You mentioned quickly the sort of presence of mailing lists in the company culture, Googler's at, Misc, et cetera. This in many ways was a kind of an early version of crowdsourcing for the work that you and I spent a lot of time on. We would get a lot of unsolicited input on marketing, on messaging, on positioning, et cetera. Do you recall any sort of interesting moments, frustrating moments, or moments of hilarity that were derivatives of those mailing lists?
There were some great moments on Googler's Misc. I remember one time Eric was doing some kind of panel where he had to show his expertise in, I think a dozen different areas of science, none of which he was familiar with. And one of them was carbon nanotubes. And he sent out an email to Googler's Misc about this. Does anybody know anything about carbon nanotubes? And Bart Voidovich, who was head of advertising operations and kind of known for his sense of humor. Bart came to Halloween one year in a leather bondage mask and I called him and a baseball bat and said he was Barry Bondage. But Bart immediately replied with a long, detailed explanation of carbon nanotubes that he had gotten from his good friend, I forget the guy's name, some scientist in Japan who happened to develop carbon nanotubes, was Bart's best friend, But it was typical that people would send very facetious replies to a lot of queries. We had a big debate over whether or not we should have bagels or donuts on Friday. That went on for hundreds of emails, and I have to confess, I was the one arguing for bagels. Ed Carroll's, but Ed Carroll's, who was one of the early engineers, would drive, I think it was a 23-mile round trip across the bay to Krispy Kreme, and he would come in on Fridays with a couple dozen boxes of donuts and put them out in the break room. And so every other week we would have bagels, and then donuts, and then bagels, and so I said, I just observed, there seemed to be a lot of donuts left at the end of Friday. There are never any bagels left. Maybe we should have bagels every week. And that did not go over well. Even though we had donuts left, people wanted to have donuts. So there was a debate, I think, that was even longer about the kind of water that should be in the coolers. And that debate went on about, how much uranium there was in the water, and naturally occurring uranium, and its benefits for your health, and the bottles and the size of the bottle. And Charlie, who
it was Ray saying, "What are you doing?"
Oh yeah. Oh well, and then your mother doesn't live. It doesn't work here. Yeah. So that was from Stacy, I think. Did she start that? No. So who started it? Ray. Oh, Ray started that. Your mother doesn't work here. Oh, Ray. Yeah. There's a whole chapter in my book on Ray. If nothing else in the book, you should read about Ray. He's the one who cut off France and stopped them from getting Google search results because he was pissed at them. So he sent out an email because the kitchens were a mess. And Ray was very fastidious in everybody else's behavior except his own. He was kind of a messy guy. But he sent out an email saying, clean up after yourself, your mother doesn't work here. And there was an immediate and vociferous response from everyone about, we're working hard, we should hire staff to clean up, or, some of the women in the office found that to be insulting because, I won't limit it to women, feminists in the office, whether they male or female, I've learned a few things, would say, this is insulting to women, why should it be the mom who cleans up, the dad should clean up. And so that went on for quite a while. There were many, the physics in Star Wars and how broken they are. I mean, come on, you could talk about that for years. And we did. Iceberg lettuce. Oh, yeah. So there was a woman, and I think, was she pregnant at the time? And she thought she had read an article that there was folic acid in lettuce and it was really healthy for the baby. And she really liked iceberg lettuce. And Charlie did not like iceberg lettuce. He compared it to polyester. He said it's like the equivalent of polyester pants. And so she kept insisting that we should have iceberg lettuce in the cafe. So Charlie went out and bought iceberg lettuce. He bought maybe a dozen heads of iceberg lettuce, and he put them in her office with like knives and scissors and pencils sticking into them. And, as a warning, it was like the horse's head in Godfather. We never had iceberg lettuce in the cafeteria, so.
Let's land with a couple more questions from Google.
I just realized there's two things I've always wondered that I've never known the answer to. They're both very quick. Number one, I started right at the time that the Segways were like vanishing like the dinosaur, and I was wondering whether there ever was a time when everyone used Segways, and did they really leave because people started to steal them? And two, is it true that we lost nap rooms because people were using them in highly inappropriate ways?
So second question first. The nap room. Heather Carnes actually walked in on somebody in the nap room, somebody who shall remain nameless at this point. But they were using the nap room not for its intended purpose. No, one. Actually, there were two. As I described it in the book, they were engaged in an act of non-computational parallel processing. So after that, they cleaned up the room and they made it an office. I don't know who ended up in that office, but so the Segways, I think the only person who used them on a regular basis was Wesley Chan. Yeah, he was always on the. He became a master of the Segway. I mean, He could go forward, backward, sideways, upstairs, downstairs, I think he lost the use of his legs at some point because he was always on the Segway. Couldn't walk anymore. But I don't know why they got rid of them. I never heard of one being stolen. We did have a scooter that disappeared mysteriously. I remember we had some customized scooters, and right around the time of the board meeting, it just disappeared. So I never found out what happened to that. But no, I don't know why the Segways disappeared.
I seem to recall they broke down a fair amount, so that might have been part
That
of
may
it.
be, yeah.
Sort of a follow-up to the Charlie and Iceberg lettuce, although this didn't actually happen. The day of Charlie's farewell party, I went to Nate, who was taking his place, and suggested that Monday there should be a giant banner over the cafeteria reading, now serving, under new management, now serving iceberg lettuce, French fries, ketchup, and a McDonald's logo.
Yeah.
Nate didn't go for it. Charlie said he would have loved it.
Yeah. Charlie wouldn't even serve ketchup. We could, for like the first, couple of months, no ketchup, because he wasn't going to serve the crap that they put in ketchup bottles until he could make his own. So we finally got ketchup when the chef started, and the kitchen started making their own ketchup, which was quite tasty. But, we went months without ketchup for fries. It was really tragic. Tragic.
I was afraid we were trending toward this direction, but I'm afraid we're going to have to land on ketchup today. This is where this discussion finishes. A very warm, very special Google thanks to Doug Edwards for coming back and sharing his insight.